Hey everyone, it's Sevy. Venti the tone-deaf bard is coming back for his third banner, ready to pull your primos into his vortex. With his abilities being beneficial for pretty much all types of players, this updated guide will cover his talents and kit, gameplay tips, talent priorities, constellations, artifact stats, artifact sets, weapons, and team comps. But before we dive in, our bard musician has something to say about a certain opera. Thank you to Opera GX for sponsoring this video. Opera GX is a web browser made for gamers that I have personally been using for the past 2 weeks, and it's made things a lot easier for me. First of all, it helps your game run with as little lag as possible when your browser is running, which is important for a laptop gamer like me. This CPU and RAM limiter in the Opera GX control panel lets you limit how much resources it's using. You can limit network bandwidth used by Opera GX as well to improve your gaming and streaming quality. Check out here how it performs compared to other browsers. Second, the browser is easy to customize. With the Easy Setup tab here in the corner, I can quickly go through light themes or dark themes, choose my neon accents, easily grab my wallpaper, and toggle all the cool features down here. There's also a GX corner that features upcoming games, free demos, and gaming news. And one more thing, Opera GX has a mobile version called GX Mobile, and you can connect it to your desktop browser to have the same tabs and accounts open. You can download Opera GX for desktop or mobile for free from my personal link in the description or pinned comment. Thanks once again to Opera GX for sponsoring. Now let's go back to the video. Let's start with his kitten gameplay. Venti's and Anemo support and DPS with the best crowd controlling potential by far, achieved by his easy to understand but potent abilities. And for the absolute beginner, to refresh your memory, Anemo units are very important since they create swirl reactions by applying Anemo on Pyro, Cryo, Hydro, or Electro. When paired with a Viridescent Venerer set, the swirl will reduce the elemental resistance of enemies depending on the element it reacted with. So for Venti, you have his skill, Skyward Sonnet, which can be tapped or held. Tapping it will create an Anemo current that deals a circle of Anemo damage, swirls if there's an element on, and quickly lifts light enemies. Holding it makes Venti charge for a bit so that he'll deal Anemo damage around him, lifts enemies higher, and also lifts Venti up. Given how long it takes to cast, I usually don't use the hold version, but if you want to see how cool it looks and have a lot of enemies around you, it's okay to use. Actually, its most useful function for me is to allow you to more easily reach hard-to-get items and explore the open world. This skill also produces elemental particles, 3 for the tap version and 4 for the hold version. You want to cast his skill first, then quickly cast the burst. That way, he will catch the particles generated and cancel the skill animation. Going into his burst, Wind's Grand Ode, this is what gives him the best crowd controller title. First, it sucks most enemies in, and depending on their weight, will either lift them up or just pull them in. There are some enemies that are resistant to the suction, such as bosses, ruin monsters, Sisson flies, and arguably the most annoying addition in the game, specters. Then it does damage multiple ways. It has its own Anemo damage over time, which procs 20 times within its 8-second duration. It can also infuse itself with an element to deal additional elemental damage. And it does continuous swirl damage on top of that. All of those sources of damage result in a flurry of numbers wherein it makes it hard to keep track of what's what sometimes, but all you really need to know is that it does a lot of damage. Now, some may say that when Venti's facing up against a boss that is immune to his burst suction, then it automatically becomes useless, which isn't true. In those cases, Venti may not be able to crowd control, but if you manage to still position the vortex to hit the resistant enemy, it will still do damage, do elemental infused damage, and swirl, which is still a lot of damage. One quirk about Venti's burst is its aiming mechanic. It doesn't have free aiming, but rather, Venti automatically targets and faces the nearby enemy, which can sometimes lead to it casting where you didn't intend it to. This is why you may want to properly reposition before casting the burst, so that there's little to no chance of aiming mishaps. For example, in Spiral Abyss or Domains, you can place your back to the wall before his burst. Venti's burst is also summoned at a certain distance away from him. For example, if you burst in front of an enemy at point-blank range, the vortex will appear behind that enemy. With light enemies, this isn't as much of a problem as they'll get sucked in anyway. However, for unpullable enemies, this can lead to his burst not hitting them at all. To remedy this, you can dash away and practice approximating how far you'd need to be for his burst to appear close or exactly where the enemy is. One more quirk is that due to Venti's burst lifting up light enemies, certain teammate abilities may not be able to hit it. For example, Xiangling's Pyronado and Rosaria's burst. There are two workarounds here. One is by using some elevated structure like GeoMC's skill to climb up and be level with the enemies. Another is by keeping Venti's character level very low, 20 levels lower than the enemies, which actually weakens his lifting power. However, this also means his damage is heavily nerfed, which I would recommend against. Lastly, unlocking his second passive gives him energy refunding mechanics after using his burst. 15 energy to himself, then if his burst absorbs an element, characters of that element will also gain 15 energy. A pretty useful passive to have in helping with your team's energy needs. When leveling his talents, it's pretty simple what to invest in. Prioritize his burst levels, as that is his biggest damage source and utility. After that comes his skill level. Then just save your resources and don't level up his normal attacks anymore since they're barely used unless you love him that much. Now for Venti's Constellations, which are designed to increase your team's overall damage output. All of them change nothing in Venti's gameplay, and I personally strongly recommend settling at C0. C1 makes Venti fire 2 extra weaker arrows with his aimed shot. This is one of the most unutilized constellations in the game unless you like doing trick shots or something. C2 lets your skill reduce the enemy's Anemo and physical resistance. It's one of the rare ways you can actually reduce Anemo resistance in the game. C3 and C5 increase your burst and skill talent level respectively, the more useful one being the burst increase since that's his largest damage source. C4 lets Venti get Anemo damage bonus through picking up particles or orbs. Just make sure to fulfill the condition before casting his burst and it's an okay damage bump. C6 just adds further elemental resistance shredding, which is overkill at this point. So when it comes to building his stats as an Anemo unit, Venti's in a unique spot wherein you can opt for an attack Anemo damage crit build, which I'll refer to as ADC, or a full elemental mastery build, which is the more conventional choice for Anemo characters, because either way Venti does well with them. But in what situations will you want to run one build type over the other? You can consider the ADC build if you're struggling to farm for an EM build, or if your existing EM pieces are allocated for Sucrose or Kazuha already, since those two need the EM more than Venti does. When you're farming the VV domain, at least those really good ADC pieces won't go to waste then. More so, if you manage to acquire God Roll ADC pieces, these can outdamage EM pieces in certain situations. Another is when Venti is in a geocentric team. The ADC build is miles better than the EM build since Venti can't swirl geo anyway, making the EM useless. But by default, you do want to target an EM build and get as much EM as you can. And don't hesitate to run 4-star EM main stat pieces too. You also want to get him to level 90 on an EM build, since swirl damage actually scales based on your character level, so max leveling him ensures your EM build has the highest damage ceiling. For the substats, you want to get EM, attack, crit, and ER. Your ER goal for Venti would be around 160 to 180%, depending how well you can battery him and how often you can use his skill and team rotations. Since Venti's Ascension stat is ER, this is easy enough to acquire through artifact substats or solely through an ER weapon. Now for artifact sets. At early AR, prioritize main stats over sets. If you're lucky enough to get possible 3 or 4-star set combos, then my recommendations are the EM buffing instructor set, the ER percent sets Exile or Scholar, or the attack percent sets Braveheart or Resolution of Sojourner. The instructor set in particular could be more favorable in certain reaction-based teams, as Venti can easily trigger the 4-piece effect, and he and his teammates can greatly benefit from the EM buff, just as long as he still has enough ER to burst often. And for late AR, the 4-piece Viridescent Venerer is still the best and only choice to maximize his utility. Once you've acquired a full set with the desired main stats, the main goal of farming more is min-maxing the substats to improve Venti's personal damage output. That's up to your patience and determination. For Venti's weapons, the first recommendation is actually a 3-star weapon, the Raven Bow, thanks to how cheap it is and how its stats synergize with Venti's kit. It's so easily refinable, and if you're just starting out or you weren't able to get the free-to-play event-limited weapon, the Windbloom Ode, it's not a bad choice until a better weapon comes along. Speaking of the 4-star Windbloom Ode, if you managed to get it way back then, it then overtakes the Raven Bow for being Venti's best free-to-play weapon. Just make sure to use use his skill first before the burst snapshots the attack buff. As for other 4-star options, the best gacha weapon is the Stringless. Not only does it beat out the Windbloom Ode by offering an unconditional damage bonus increase that gets so much better with refinements, but no other 4-star weapon can hold a candle, or should I say string, to it. At high refinements, it even outdoes R1 5-star bows on Venti. It's even more potent on Venti with Bennett, as Bennett's attack buff complements the damage multiplier Stringless gives. Other 4-star options I could somewhat consider if you have none of the previous options are 1. The Alley Hunter, which is like an attack version of the Stringless on him, or 2. The Viridescent Hunt, which helps build his crit stats and looks pretty good on him but gives a somewhat redundant suction effect. Then for 5-star options, the top choice is between his latest signature weapon, the Elegy for the End, and the Skyward Harp. The Elegy has the benefit of providing almost all of Venti's needed ER and boosting your team's overall damage through the EM and attack buff. This is mainly beneficial on teams that can take advantage of the EM buff even if you can only proc its effect once every 2 rotations. Otherwise, on Venti teams that don't rely as much on EM, such as Freeze or Geo teams, other attack, damage, or crit boosting weapons, and even Stringless are better. The Skyward Harp, which is more suited for an attack crit Venti build, now has 2 other bow contenders, Thundering Pulse and Polar Star. However, if you have those, they'll mainly just serve as crit stat 6, and taking advantage of their effects is a convoluted process. You're better off equipping them on other suitable bow users. The Skyward Harp still reigns supreme for being a convenient plug-and-play boost to Venti's stats. Finally, for team comps. Venti has a flexible Anemo kit and build and generally works as a flex slot sub DPS, so if you just want to chuck him in a team comp, he'll likely work well. Of course, there are certain teams where Venti feels more godlike. First and foremost is the Permafreeze team comp template that consists of Venti, a Hydro, and 2 Cryos. The idea here is that Venti will group enemies together and become frozen, easy targets for your team to destroy. Even after Venti's burst, they've already been grouped together and will stay permafrozen in place. The most popular team that utilizes this freeze team template is the Morgana team, whose members are Venti, Mona, Ganyu, and Diona. Venti and Ganyu's burst synergize extremely well to funnel all the icicles in Venti's section. Mona is there for Hydro application and amplifying the team's damage via her Omen, and Diona will ensure your team stays alive through shield and heals. It's a very satisfying team to play indeed. Next, if you're an arsonist, you're going to love this Mono Pyro team composed of Venti, Kazuha, Xiangling, and Bennett. It sounds weird, yes, especially since we have the 2 Anemos together, but in practice, I found it works great. This is basically a high pyro damage AoE team since literally everyone has pyro abilities, even Venti and Kazuha due to their elemental infusions. It works especially well against enemy groups that can't be lifted so that Xiangling's Pyronado is guaranteed to hit them. This also happens to be one of the very rare teams wherein C6 Bennett shines, since everyone benefits from his C6 pyro damage bonus. After Venti with the Arsonists, we have Venti with the Rock Lovers. While Geo can't be swirled, Venti's viability for an ADC build and his crowd controlling mechanics make him synergize well with Geo characters and comps. The template will be Venti, 2 Geos, and a flex slot. Grouping enemies allows Ningguang to more easily target them and deal splash damage. Albedo's burst also benefits by gaining quadratic scaling as well. Ito and Venti are also a good duo since Ito's charged attacks can still reach the enemies lifted by Venti. Next, Venti in an Overload comp, composed of Venti and at least 1 Pyro and Electro, isn't a bad choice against small mobs. Overload has the annoying effect of staggering enemies away from you, but Venti's burst fixes that, so you can deal your overloads without fear of spreading your enemies too far away. Units that can reach Venti's lift, like Klee and Yoimiya, are a must here. Lastly, Venti works well in certain Electro Charge comps, the template being Venti, 1 Hydro, and 2 Electros. In this case, we have 2 free-to-play starter characters who can shine in this team, Lisa and Barbara. Venti can easily shred Hydro and Electro since Electro charged reactions keep both Electro and Hydro auras on the enemies. The option to put on a Tales of the Thrilling Dragon Slayers makes this furthermore very free-to-play friendly. So everyone, that's it for this updated Venti guide. Let me know in the comments if you're pulling him this rerun, or if you have him already, which teams you enjoy playing Venti in. I'd love to know. Check out my previous video on my thoughts about Venti's relevance as well. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to leave a like, consider subscribing to my channel for more Genshin Impact guides and content, and I will see you all soon. Take care!